Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Saturday, joined by Dr. John Joy, continuing with our series here on understanding the magisterium. And in this series, this lecture, I guess we would say of this series, we're going to be discussing the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff, taking a deep dive into the First Vatican Council and looking at the different indicators for papal infallibility, the different criteria that it lists. So we're going to take a close examination of those. What I'm going to do, though, is pass it over to Dr. Joy, and I'm going to get out of the way. I'll be here, but you'll be on the screen. And if you need me to present anything on your screen, just let me know, and you can share your screen and pull up a PowerPoint if you need to, but you don't have to.
If I were prepared ahead of time and had something nice like that ready to go, we'd do it.
Right.
But I just got random notes.
No worries. Well, I'll be here.
All right. Thanks so much, Michael. So yeah, like Michael just said, we're gonna look closely at the text of the definition of papal infallibility from Vatican I, specifically to identify what those key criteria are for us to recognize when the Pope speaks infallibly, and then to crack each of them open a little bit, and in each case, for each different criterion of papal infallibility, I'm gonna dig into a couple of questions of application, right? So first of all, what are the conditions, and then in the individual cases, how is each of them supposed to be applied or not applied? So we'll try to look at how to apply these in practice and how to not apply them in practice as well. So I'll just start with the text of Vatican I. This is probably familiar to anybody who's bothered to watch 6 lectures now on the Magisterium. You've probably seen this before, but it says, therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian faith, for the glory of God our Savior, the exaltation of the Catholic religion, and for the salvation of the Christian people, with the approval of the Sacred Council, we teach and define as a divinely revealed dogma that the Roman Pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. He possesses, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his Church to enjoy in defining doctrine concerning faith and morals, and therefore such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not by the consent of the Church. That was one sentence, so probably get some points taken off for a run-on sentence on a high school paper. And then it says, should anyone, therefore, which God forbid, have the temerity to contradict this our definition, let him be anathema. So it's a long, complicated sentence. There's a lot packed in there, and it can be a little bit challenging to pull out the most essential points when we're thinking about this question of how to recognize when the Pope speaks ex cathedra or infallibly. And the first question we have to ask is even how many conditions. Well, we will have to ask what the conditions are, but there's already controversy at the level of how many conditions there are. So how to break out that text from the center of that definition into distinct criteria. What parts of it, belong together, are part of the same, are describing the same, one and the same criterion, and which parts are really describing separate criteria. So I've seen authors identify 5 separate conditions, 4 separate conditions, and 3 separate conditions. I'm not aware of anybody arguing for 2 or 6. Maybe they exist, I just haven't seen them. But 3, 4, and 5 seem to be the most common claims made about the number of conditions. I hold that there are 3. I'll get to that in a moment. But just to give you a couple examples. So John Henry Newman, for example, identified 4 conditions when he was explaining or trying to explain papal infallibility in his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk. Newman says that the Pope speaks infallibly when he speaks first as the universal teacher, second in the name and with the authority of the apostles, third on a point of faith or morals, and fourth with the purpose of binding every member to the church of the church to accept and believe his decision. So that's four. Monsignor Joseph Clifford Fenton, who's the great American theologian of the early 20th century, he listed five. So he basically took Newman's four and he broke the last one into two parts. So he says the five criteria are: A, he speaks in his capacity as ruler and teacher of all Christians. B, he uses his supreme apostolic authority. C, the doctrine on which he is speaking has to do with faith or morals. D, he issues a certain and definitive judgment on that teaching. And E, he wills that this definitive judgment be accepted as such by the universal church. So there you see, four or five, where the difference is whether the last two that Monsignor Fenton enumerates really belong together as one criteria, as Newman enumerates. And then Bishop Gasser, however, so I hold that there were three conditions for a couple of reasons. Based on the explanation of the text given at the First Vatican Council by Bishop Gasser. He was a member of the Deputation on Faith, which drafted the text of the definition of papal infallibility, and he was the relator at the council, meaning he's the one who explained the intended sense. He explained what the words the deputation put on the page were intended to signify, so that the council fathers would have a clear idea of what was meant when they were voting for or against the text. So in his explanation of the intended meaning of this formula about papal infallibility, he only mentions three essential conditions, and then the Second Vatican Council, in its reformulation of the same teaching on papal infallibility, also only gives three conditions. So that's essentially why I think the view that there are three is correct. But just to see a kind of that nobody's bringing in new criteria from left field. The difference is that the first two that both Newman and Fenton list, first, that he has to be acting as the universal teacher of the whole church, and second, that he has to be using or invoking his supreme apostolic authority. In Bishop Gasser's explanations of the intended sense of the definition, and in the Second Vatican Council's reformulation of the same teaching, those two are much more clearly combined, or they boil down to the same thing, basically. So let me get to those other texts. So in Bishop Gasser's Relatio, he describes three conditions, or what he calls restrictions, on the infallibility of the Pope. So the papal infallibility is restricted in three ways. First, he says it is restricted by reason of the subject. When the Pope, constituted in the chair of Peter, that is, in the center of the church, speaks as universal teacher and supreme judge. So there's a condition that pertains to the subject. He has to be acting as the universal teacher and supreme judge of the church. There's nothing there about invoking his supreme apostolic authority. Second, Gasser says it is restricted by reason of the object when treating of matters of faith and morals. There's pretty good agreement. Everybody identifies that as a distinct condition. And then Gasser goes on, the third, it is restricted by reason of the act when the Pope defines what is to be believed or rejected by all the faithful. So he gives that, he puts that in one condition. He defines what is to be believed or rejected by all the faithful, as Newman puts that as one condition, whereas Fenton breaks that into two. If we look at the Second Vatican Council's reformulation of this, you have the clearest confirmation. This is important, by the way, because remember, every additional restriction that you place on papal infallibility will mean that fewer and fewer things can be recognized as ex cathedra teaching, right? So if there are 5 distinct conditions that all have to be met for something to be ex cathedra, then that will translate into there being fewer acts of papal teaching that we can recognize as infallible. Whereas when you reduce it, if there are only 4 criteria, then there are a few more things, right? There are less criteria to meet, which means they're met more often, which means there'll be a greater number of papal statements that we would have to acknowledge as being infallible. And if there are only 3, that widens the scope of papal infallibility even a bit more. Now, Vatican II gives a much clearer and more succinct enumeration of these conditions. You won't hear people say that very often. Vatican II was clearer than Vatican I on this point. So you have 2 options here. Either Vatican II's 3 conditions are really the same as Vatican I's. So either they give the same number of conditions, which means in Vatican I, you really only have 3 conditions and not 5, which is what Bishop Gasser at Vatican I said anyway. Or you would have to say that there are 4 or 5 given at Vatican I. But what that would mean is that Vatican II, by only giving 3 conditions, would have widened the scope of infallibility beyond what was set forth by the First Vatican Council. And although that's not logically impossible, it would be very, very surprising. It would be an odd interpretation of Vatican II to think that in Lumen Gentium they were trying to broaden the scope of our understanding of papal infallibility. I don't think that's plausible at all. And in any case, it makes more sense to read these as consistent with each other and to read Vatican I according to the explanation of its own text given by Gasser at the time. So the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium describes papal infallibility this way, describes the conditions for papal infallibility this way. It says that the Roman Pontiff, head of the College of Bishops, in virtue of his office, that's equivalent to in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, enjoys this infallibility when, and then gives the conditions. So what that does is it takes the line about in virtue of, which is describing why he has this or the basis of this infallible power, and it removes it grammatically outside the list of the conditions of infallibility. So in Vatican I, you have the conditions for infallibility intermingled with descriptions of their basis. So you had in Vatican I, the Pope is infallible when acting as supreme shepherd and teacher of the whole church in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority. He defines what Vatican II has done here by removing the in virtue of his office. It takes the descriptor of the basis of the infallible teaching and puts it more clearly distinct from the enumeration of conditions for infallibility. So it is in virtue of the supreme apostolic authority that he has. Because of that, he's infallible when, right? And then you've eliminated in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority as a distinct condition. It's not a distinct condition, it's the basis of the conditions. So back to Vatican II. The Roman Pontiff, head of the College of Bishops, in virtue of his office, enjoys this infallibility when, as supreme shepherd and teacher of all Christ's faithful, who confirms his brethren in their faith. So again, you have the supreme shepherd and teacher, and then a scriptural basis for it that you didn't have in Vatican I. So again, that who confirms his brethren in the faith can't be taken as a new condition for infallibility, but it can be taken as providing a scriptural reference for the first condition. So then the text goes on. When, as supreme shepherd and teacher of all Christ's faithful, That's the first condition, who confirms his brethren in their faith. Second, he proclaims by a definitive act. Proclaims by a definitive act. So that's equivalent to defines. And then third, on the part of the object, he proclaims a definitive act. He proclaims by a definitive act a doctrine on faith or morals. That's the third condition. And that's the end of it for Vatican I. So there's no reference to, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority in the conditions. That's removed and placed before the list of conditions. And there's no separate reference to the idea that he's defining something to be held by the whole church. Not that that's not an important point, and it's included in Vatican I for a reason, but it's equivalently covered when you say that the Pope is acting as supreme shepherd and teacher of all Christ's faithful. So in other words, if there were a case where the Pope was defining something that didn't have to be held by the whole church, then he wouldn't be acting in his capacity as head of the whole church. So anything he does as head of the whole church necessarily has reference to the whole church. And so it's not necessary to include as a distinct condition, the way Fenton does, that this idea of making the doctrine binding on the whole church, that is included. I mean, that's part of the idea of papal infallibility, but it's not a distinct condition separate from the first condition, which is that he's acting in his capacity as universal shepherd and teacher of the whole church. So if you break it all the way out into 5, like Monsignor Fenton does, you have 2 sets of redundancies, basically. So, or if you break it out into 4, the way Cardinal Newman did, you have 1 set of redundancy. The first redundancy is that is the one I just described. Anytime that the Pope speaks as universal, sorry, let me back up. Okay, yeah. The one redundancy is that one I just described. Anytime the Pope speaks as universal head of the church, supreme head of the universal church, then any judgments issued by him in that capacity have to be held by the whole church, and vice versa. Those amount to one and the same thing. And the other redundancy, when you break them out into 4 or 5, is when the first 2 conditions that Cardinal Newman names, when the Pope acts as supreme head of the whole church in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority. He can't act as head of the whole church otherwise than by his supreme apostolic authority. It's only his supreme apostolic authority that allows him to act as head of the whole church, and vice versa. He can't act as head of the whole church without using his supreme apostolic authority. All right, so I'm going to stick with, I think I've even mentioned in previous lectures, these 3 conditions. So it's probably coming a little bit late to describe more fully the basis for the view that there are 3 and only 3 conditions. But that's what we're going to use and take for granted the rest of the way through. One more comment. Some people do try to add another condition from elsewhere in the same documents. Namely, people will try to take as a condition for recognizing infallible papal statements the doctrine that's put forward after I think prior to the definition in Vatican I and after the description of papal infallibility in Vatican II. So at Vatican I, there's a line earlier in chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus where it says, quote, "The Holy Spirit was promised to the successors of Peter, not so that they might by his revelation make known some new doctrine, but that by his assistance they might religiously guard and faithfully expound the revelation or deposit of faith transmitted by the apostles." So the First Vatican Council very clearly teaches that infallibility, the teaching of infallibility does not mean the Pope is able to receive new revelations or proclaim new teachings. It's an infallible guarantee that his acts of passing on the same faith received from Christ through the apostles will be preserved from error. The Second Vatican Council says something very similar. When either the Roman pontiff or the body of bishops together with him defines a judgment, it says, they pronounce it in accordance with revelation itself, which all are obliged to abide by and be in conformity with. That teaching in Vatican I and Vatican II, it's a very important teaching. So I'm not trying to downplay it here, but it's not a distinct criteria for recognizing papal infallibility. I can sympathize with the sentiment of people who treat it that way. So in other words, people will look at something a pope says, and they'll say, well, it's an innovation. It's not part of the tradition. Therefore, he can't have been speaking ex cathedra. And that's a little bit too simplistic. Because if you treat it that way, if you treat that idea that the doctrine, in order to be infallible, the doctrine has to be traditional and not innovative. And again, I have a lot of sympathy for that. Doctrinal innovations should be anathema to any good Catholic. Doctrinal innovations is not what we're all about. It's the teaching of Jesus Christ which saves. So what matters to us is to know what Jesus Christ himself taught so that we can believe that and achieve our salvation. No good Catholic is interested in doctrinal innovations. So I can sympathize with the sentiment of wanting to discard a papal teaching that might look innovative. But you can't treat it as a condition for identifying infallible teachings. Because if you do, you reduce the dogma of papal infallibility to a meaningless, empty formula. It would amount to saying, right, if your criteria for acknowledging a papal teaching to be infallible includes that it must in fact conform to divine revelation and to the sacred tradition, that would amount to saying that the Pope is infallible whenever he gets it right. But absolutely everyone is infallible in this sense. I think I touched on this kind of fundamental argument last time in another context. Everybody's infallible when they are faithfully transmitting divine revelation. Anytime that I am faithfully transmitting divine revelation, I'm infallible, and so are you. So if that's all it means for the Pope to be infallible, then it doesn't mean anything. So what does this requirement mean, though? Because it does mean something. It's essential to see that this statement in Vatican I and Vatican II about the Pope not being given new revelations or infallibility not being given in order to invent new doctrines. That's not given as a condition by which we can judge whether the Pope has spoken infallibly. That's given as an assurance, a divine assurance that when the Pope does fulfill the three essential conditions, of which this is not one, then in those cases, what the Pope says will in fact, by a divine guarantee, be in accordance with divine revelation, be in accordance with the tradition received from Christ through the apostles, and not be a new innovation. So this is why both Vatican I and Vatican II rightly place this teaching about not being a revelation and not being given for new doctrine, place this teaching outside their enumeration of conditions for papal infallibility. So again, to take an example that I think I've used before, it would not be correct to say, right? So if you entertain the hypothetical possibility of the Pope, by his supreme apostolic authority, we declare and define that there are four persons in the Holy Trinity, and that all Catholics are obliged to believe this by divine and Catholic faith, and that anybody who doesn't believe this, anathema sit. If you take that imaginative scenario, you cannot say, okay, let me try to back up. You could look at that in two different ways in terms of infallibility, right? Because it would obviously be contradictory to the most fundamental dogma of the Christian faith. You could view it in two ways. I think that a lot of people who treat this idea of the necessary fidelity to tradition in the infallible teaching of the church, if you treat this as a distinct condition for papal infallibility, you're going to want to say that that scenario is possible to happen, that the Pope could say those things, but that it would be okay somehow because he wouldn't be defining them infallibly because he'd failed to meet this essential condition, and so God could allow him to do that, and we would just have to be able to recognize that he wasn't speaking ex cathedra in that case, and so we shouldn't believe him. Well, and so he could err, and in fact, in such a case, would have erred. But I think that's wrong. If you look at it that way, then you are reducing the dogma of infallibility to an empty and meaningless formula. You and I are all infallible, each infallible in the same exact sense. The right way to think about that scenario is that the whole point of the dogma of infallibility is that God would prevent that scenario from happening. So it's not that if it happens, we would have to recognize it as not meeting the criteria. Rather, it's saying that hypothetical scenario does meet the criteria, which means it won't happen. It can't happen. That's what we believe when we believe in the infallibility of the church, and when we believe in the infallibility of the Pope specifically, that God would not allow the church or the Pope to pronounce such a thing in such a way. The dogma of papal infallibility does not account for, it does not help us sort out how to react to such a hypothetical situation. It rules out such a hypothetical situation. So that's not an additional criteria for an infallibility. That's a divine assurance having to do with infallibility. Okay. That's all I wanted to say for a general look at the three conditions. Let's get into the specifics. So the subject, the object, and the act are the three conditions. The subject, who's teaching? It has to be the Pope, qua Pope, the Pope in his capacity as Pope. That means head of the whole church and not just as Bishop of Rome or as private individual. So the subject, who's teaching? The object, what is he teaching about? That's faith and morals. The act means how is he teaching? And that has to do with, is he teaching in a definitive or a binding way, or is he teaching in a more general propositional way? Propositional in the sense of setting something forth as true versus ruling that it must be held as true. We'll get to that again in a moment, but let's start with the subject of the magisterium. So just to review the key language of the texts, in Vatican I, the subject of the magisterium is described as the Pope exercising his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians. Bishop Gasser's explanation of that line: the infallibility of the Pope is restricted by reason of the subject, that is, when the Pope, constituted in the chair of Peter, the center of the church, speaks as universal teacher and supreme judge. Gasser again, in another point of his speech, clarifies that when we treat the subject of infallibility, namely the Roman pontiff, as pontiff, i.e., as a public person in relation to the universal church, not, first of all, when he decrees something as a private teacher. So that would be the Pope not acting as a public person, nor only as bishop and ordinary of a particular see and province. So that would be relation in, the Pope could act as a public person in relation to his own diocese, right? When he teaches just as the local bishop of the Diocese of Rome, but only when he teaches as exercising his office as supreme pastor and teacher of all Christians. So his teaching has to be public, official, something coming really from him in his official capacity. So not off-the-cuff remarks, not airplane interviews, not the Jesus of Nazareth books written by Pope Benedict XVI as a private scholar when he was Pope. So not the private or unofficial or off-the-cuff remarks, and not the stuff that is directed only to his own diocese, but it has to be his public and official teaching in relation to the universal church. Vatican II puts it very similarly. The Roman pontiff, in virtue of his office, enjoys this infallibility when, as supreme shepherd and teacher of all Christ's faithful. So he has to be acting publicly as the supreme head of the universal church. That's the condition. Okay, two kind of questions that I want to dig into about this that I think lead to a lot of misapplications of this criterion. One is, does he have to explicitly invoke his supreme authority? Does he have to say, in virtue of my supreme apostolic authority, or something like that? They do say that a lot of times, the popes, in their ex cathedra definitions, but do they have to? And the answer, I think, should be sufficiently clear from what we've said before. The answer is no. So that's not given as a separate condition, but it is a really good indication. So a distinction that I'm going to use over and over and over again the rest of this lecture as we look at each of these criteria is a distinction between what is sufficient and what is necessary. So if the Pope says when he teaches, something like in virtue of my supreme apostolic authority, that is a sufficient indication that this condition is being fulfilled, because he doesn't have supreme apostolic authority on the basis of anything else than his office of supreme shepherd and teacher of the universal church. So the criterion, the condition is acting as head of the universal church. When he invokes his supreme apostolic authority, that's a sufficient proof that he is fulfilling this condition, but it's not a necessary. It's not a necessary proof. It's not necessary to prove that he fulfills this condition, because he can do it in other ways, right? If the other easiest way he can do it is by explicitly addressing his teaching to the universal church. So at the top of many papal documents, especially the more recent ones, the Pope addresses his teaching to the bishops of the universal church and all of the faithful, and sometimes even to other people of goodwill and so forth. So that also makes it clear that he's acting, when he does that, in his capacity as head of the whole church. So invoking the supreme apostolic authority is sufficient but not necessary to fulfill this condition. Similarly, the second frequent misapplication is just the opposite one. Explicitly addressing his teaching to the universal church is also sufficient to fulfill this condition, but it's also not necessary to fulfill this condition. This one I want to unpack a little bit more. So remember that Vatican I says that the Pope is infallible when he defines a doctrine to be held by the whole church. So the question really is, does he have to specify when he defines that the doctrine he's defining must be held by the whole church? Or is that sufficiently implied in the exercise of his supreme apostolic authority? And I would say we have to take the second line on that. We have to interpret it, well, we have to answer that no, it's not necessary for him to directly address the universal church. That would be a good indication, sufficient, but not necessary. Why? Because if the Pope, acting in his capacity as supreme teacher of the universal church, were to impose a doctrine of faith or morals on any one part of the church directly, then by that very fact, he would also indirectly be imposing the same doctrine on the whole church. I want to give you an example of this to see what it looks like in practice. So there's a very little known encyclical letter of Pope Gregory XVI called Commissum Divinitus. which he addressed only to the clergy of Switzerland, not to the universal church. Sometime in the middle of the 1800s. I don't have the date anymore. It might be 1835 or something like that. Do I have it? Yeah, 1835. So it's addressed only to the clergy of Switzerland, right? But two things to pay attention to. In virtue of what authority could the Pope issue a definitive ruling for the clergy of Switzerland? Nobody else in the church could do that. So it's only in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority that the Pope could give a binding ruling on a controversy that was happening in Switzerland. So when the Pope exercises authority outside of his own diocese, he can only do that in virtue of, he can only do that by acting as head of the universal church. And then a second indication is within the text, he invokes the fullness of his apostolic power. So he explicitly invokes his supreme apostolic authority, which again, he doesn't have supreme apostolic authority except in his capacity of supreme shepherd and teacher of the whole church. So here's what he says. He's condemning the so-called Baden articles drawn up by a convention that met in the town of Baden in Switzerland. So he says, with the fullness of the apostolic power, we reprove and condemn the aforementioned articles of the meeting of Baden as containing false, rash, and erroneous assertions, as detracting from the rights of the Holy See, overthrowing the government of the church and its divine constitution, and subjecting the ecclesiastical ministry to secular domination, and as proceeding from condemned premises. We decree that they should forever be considered condemned. So if you're evaluating a statement like that to see whether it hits the criteria for papal infallibility, and you start with this first one, the question is not, is the Pope speaking to the universal church? The question is the Pope acting in his capacity as head of the universal church? And he certainly is, because it's only in virtue of that capacity that he could invoke the fullness of the apostolic power and issue a definitively binding condemnation like that for any part of the church. And it is that last piece of the Vatican I description that says he defines something to be held by the whole church. That's implied sufficiently by the fact that he invokes the fullness of his apostolic power. So in other words, if you don't live in Switzerland, you're still obliged to follow this teaching, right? So we would all be equally obliged to hold that the articles of the meeting of Baden, which I don't know what they are, we'd have to look that up. We would all be equally obliged to hold that those contain false, rash, and erroneous assertions, etc. So the Pope does not have to be explicitly addressing the universal church. He just has to be acting as supreme head of the church. One more important kind of category of papal statements that often get overlooked when this condition is applied wrongly. It has often happened that a pope has imposed a profession of faith on some individual or group as a condition for union with the Catholic Church, for union with the Roman Church into the body of the Catholic Church. So, for example, there's the formula of Pope Hormisdas for the Acacians, 517, the formula of Pope Innocent III for the Waldensians in 1208, the formula of Gregory XIII for the Greco-Russian Church in 1575, Pope Benedict XIV for the Maronites in 1743. In lots of cases in church history where there's been schism and then reunion, the reunion is accomplished by mutual agreement to a profession of faith that sets out, we both believe this formula which captures the essence of the faith, and so we can unite. Now, even though the Pope, in those cases, when he sets out a profession of faith or agrees to a profession of faith with some group in order to establish union, even though he's only requiring this one group to sign off on the profession of faith, so it's only addressed to this one group directly, it's clear that he can't do that, that when he does that, he must be acting in his capacity as supreme head of the universal church, because it could only be as the supreme head of the church that he could have the authority to determine the conditions for union with the church. So in other words, my own local bishop can't require on his own authority some profession of faith in order to bring a schismatic group into union with the Church of Rome. The Pope would have to accept that in order for that group to be brought into union with the Church of Rome. So even though cases like this are not explicitly directed to the whole church, they still fulfill the condition of the Pope acting as head of the whole church. Okay, part two. Well, I don't know. Part 2b, conditions for the object of the magisterium. We talked a lot about the object in the last 2 lectures, so I only want to recap this very, very briefly. The condition is that it has to be a doctrine concerning faith or morals. The Vatican I, Vatican II, and are both very succinct. It's just they use the exact same words: a doctrine concerning faith or morals. That's it. Bishop Gasser's explanations of that are very, very long. We looked at those in some more detail a couple lectures ago. The condition is just that the Pope has to be proposing doctrine as something that pertains to faith or morals. So the 2 questions that I want to just touch on briefly here as well, misunderstandings or misapplications of this criterion. One is, does the Pope have to be defining dogma specifically or condemning heresy specifically in order to speak infallibly? The answer is no, and that's what we talked about a lot the last 2 lectures. So I don't want to get into that per se, but just to point out that this has been a long-standing point of confusion amongst Catholic scholars. So this is not just the kind of thing that like scholars all agree on, but Joe Catholic in the pew might have a misunderstanding about. This has really been a stumbling block for Catholic theologians since the Vatican Council. And it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly why that might be. Well, a couple of reasons. One, Bishop Gasser's explanations at this point were long, complicated, and somewhat meandering. So it's forgivable if maybe somebody didn't follow exactly what he was saying. I mean, if a bishop took a brief nap during a 4-hour speech, he might have missed some key points, right? And then the text of Gasser's speech was published in the Acts of the First Vatican Council, but how many people are really going back to read those, right? So that's one factor in this misunderstanding. What misunderstanding? Almost since the day the First Vatican Council closed, prominent Catholic theologians have been pushing the line that the Pope is not infallible or he's not speaking ex cathedra unless he's defining dogma specifically or condemning heresy specifically. Now that's not true, as we looked at in the last 2 lectures. So I'm trying to get at why I think that misunderstanding has perpetuated. So one point is Gasser's explanation was complicated. A second explanation, well, I don't know if this is an explanation, but just something to point out. One of the first kind of prominent publications after the First Vatican Council on this point was the Austrian Bishop Joseph Fessler, who had been a secretary at the First Vatican Council, so he had had a kind of prominent role. He wrote a book immediately after the council called The True and False Infallibility. And in that book, he said that the Pope is infallible only when he defines truths as divinely revealed or condemns errors as heretical. So he limited papal infallibility in that book to the primary object of the magisterium. Now he did that because he was trying to combat some of the. So there was this old Catholic schism at the time. Dollinger and some other prominent German theologians, especially, didn't accept the teaching of papal infallibility. The liberal governments of Europe were mostly furious about the definition of papal infallibility because they didn't like the idea that something like the syllabus of errors might be infallibly defined, which condemns all kinds of aspects of modern liberal governments. So there's a very contentious sort of situation. And so my suspicion is that somebody like Bishop Fessler was trying to downplay the scope of infallibility as much as he could in order to make it as acceptable as he could to the to the old Catholics perhaps, and to the civil authorities perhaps. John Henry Newman is doing the same kind of thing in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk. He's trying to downplay the teaching on infallibility as much as he can in order to make it as acceptable as he can to the non-Catholic political authorities. Especially because, remember, Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors had come out like 6 years before this. So that was like the papal teaching that was at the front of people's minds when they're having these conversations. Okay, and then to top that off, Pope Pius IX wrote a letter to Bishop Fessler thanking him for his great book, right? And so then there's this kind of unofficial semi-approval, papal approval of Fessler's book. And Fessler's book has this very limited view of papal infallibility, where it only pertains to dogma and condemnations of heresy. Now, of course, a private papal letter has no magisterial authority of its own, but a more important point is that approval of a book, like thanking him for writing this helpful book, does not imply approval of every detail of his book, which was good in many other ways. So that's not really a good reason for interpreting papal infallibility more narrowly than what the text says. But those are probably some of the historical reasons why that misunderstanding has been with us ever since. Now, Vatican II and later teachings of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith and so on have cleared this up, where it is now very, very clear that the Church teaches that infallibility does extend to the secondary object, like we looked at the last couple of lectures. But somehow there's still a gap in a lot of the theological literature where an author will acknowledge that infallibility extends to the secondary object in general, but then when he's treating the conditions for ex cathedra teaching specifically, you still find theologians slipping into this idea that it's not ex cathedra unless it's dogmatic, or unless it's condemning heresy. Okay, let's skip ahead because we talked enough about that. So the third and last condition for ex cathedra teaching has to do with the act of teaching. Vatican I says when he defines a doctrine, or Vatican II when he proclaims a doctrine by a definitive act. So we want to look at this defining or definitive act of teaching. Bishop Gasser comments at length on this point as well in a couple of different places. So in one place, the kind of short summary that Bishop Gasser gives is that the Pope is infallible when he defines what must be believed or rejected by all the faithful. But in a couple of other places in his speech, he unpacks a little more what that means to define specifically. So he says, what does it mean that the Pope must define a doctrine? It means that there is required the manifest intention of defining doctrine. Okay, what does that mean? He gives two answers to that, or two ways that the Pope could define doctrine. either of putting an end to a doubt about a certain doctrine. So if the Pope teaches in such a way as to put an end to a doubt about a doctrine, that's defining. Defining has nothing to do with like the grammatical or logical definition of a thing. The root of the word in Latin is finis, which means end point. It's the limit, it's the end, it's the conclusion. So a definitive teaching is like a final or conclusive teaching. It concludes, it puts an end to any possible doubt about the doctrine. Okay, let me go back to Gasser. So he had said defining a doctrine is either putting an end to a doubt about a doctrine, that would be definitive, that would be defining, or defining a thing by giving a definitive judgment and proposing that doctrine as one which must be held by the universal church. So when the Pope says something like, this must be held by the church, all Catholics must believe this, that's the note of definition. When the Pope takes up a matter about which there has been controversy and gives his judgment in a way that makes it clear that he intends there to not be controversy after this point, that's the note of definition, when he gives a definitive judgment. Gasser goes on and says, quote, this last point is indeed something intrinsic to every dogmatic definition of faith or morals that is taught by the supreme pastor and teacher of the universal church, and which is to be held by the universal church. Indeed, this very property and note of a definition, properly so called, should be expressed, at least in some way, since he is defining doctrine to be held by the universal church. So a couple of key points there. One, this is the key note of definition, properly so called. The key note, which means the popes very, very frequently act in capacity of supreme pastor and teacher of the universal church. And the popes very, very frequently speak about matters of faith and morals. Those first two conditions are fulfilled very, very frequently in the life of the church. This one is not. This one is the very property and note of a definition, properly so called. This is the key point that you're looking for when you're trying to identify whether something is ex cathedra. It's very, very easy most of the time to say, well, is this an official statement of the Pope acting as Pope? Yes. Is he talking about faith or morals? Yes. Check those boxes most of the time. Is he defining a doctrine? The answer is usually no. Is he defining a doctrine? Because not only does it have to be definitive, this intention of defining has to be manifest. It has to be visible, at least in some way. There's no one specific formula that the Pope has to use, but he has to make it clear. You and I reading a document can't just be saying, well, I think it's definitive. I think he was probably trying to put an end to a doubt about a doctrine. That's not good enough. The intention of the Pope to define doctrine, meaning to put an end to a doubt about a doctrine, or to propose a doctrine in such a way that it must be held by the universal church, that point has to be manifest. That means clearly evident. Now, that doesn't mean clearly evident to everybody. It might be there, and some people just don't see it because they don't grasp all of the necessary things to grasp. So it doesn't mean that it has to be so evident that nobody could possibly disagree. But it does mean that to argue successfully that a given papal statement is infallible, you have to be able to show that the intention to define is clearly present in the act of teaching. You can't import that assumption from elsewhere. Okay, Bishop Gasser gives one more kind of lengthy description of what the word defines means in the First Vatican Council's teaching. He says the Deputation on Faith, which had drafted the text, is not of the mind that this word defines should be understood in a juridical sense, so that it would only signify putting an end to controversy which has arisen in respect to heresy and doctrine which is properly speaking de fide. So that's the controversy about the primary and secondary object. Rather, he says, the word defines signifies that the Pope directly and conclusively pronounces his sentence about a doctrine that concerns faith or morals in such a way that each one of the faithful can be certain of the mind of the Roman Pontiff. So directly and conclusively is another good way of thinking about and talking about this key note of definition. So to put several of those together now, when we're looking for definitions, we're looking for cases where the Pope is speaking definitively, when he's putting an end to a doubt about a doctrine, when he's giving a definitive judgment, when he's proposing a doctrine as one which must be held by the universal church, or directly and conclusively pronouncing his sentence about a doctrine. I think the easiest way to understand the distinction between this kind of teaching, definitive teaching, and ordinary teaching, and I don't mean ordinary magisterium, leave that out of your head for now. Let me use a different word. The distinction between definitive teaching and usual teaching, definitive teaching and non-definitive teaching, is very much like it's the difference between the way a teacher acts in a classroom, that's teaching and it's non-definitive, and the way a judge acts in a courtroom. So the Pope, so a teacher in a classroom will say to his students, this is the case, and here are the reasons why it's the case. And he hopes that the students will be persuaded by the soundness of the reasoning to agree that this is the case. He's teaching them by presenting them truth and presenting them reasons for the truth. That's teaching. Here's what's true. Here are the reasons for believing that it's true. And then you're hoping that the student sees the reasons and so concludes that the truth is correct. That's teaching, and the popes do that a lot. And that's their non-infallible magisterium, which is the subject of an upcoming lecture, I think. Judging is something very different. So sometimes the Pope says not only, here's what's true, but he also says, he acts as maybe a lawgiver, sometimes as a judge, sometimes as a lawgiver. There's a legal aspect to it. Not only here's what's true, but also the lawgiver, and you must believe it, right? Teachers don't do that. Good teachers don't do that. I mean, they'll mark you wrong on the test, right? But they're not standing there imposing truth on you. When the church teaches definitively, she is imposing truth. I know that makes people uncomfortable, but that is absolutely what she's doing. The Pope says, not only here's what's true, but also to be a good Catholic, you must believe it. That's the definitive note. You must believe it when he's laying down the law. And then there's a judging. It could be judging as opposed to law giving. I mean, those are closely related. So you can also imagine a scenario where there's a dispute between Catholics are arguing about, is doctrine A true or doctrine B? And the Pope issues a judgment saying doctrine A is true, and he gives a definitive ruling on that in the manner of a judge and not just in the manner of a teacher. So when you have that note of judge or lawgiver combined with the note of teaching, that's the extraordinary magisterium. That's the note of definition, properly speaking. And it always has this note of finality, conclusiveness, definitiveness, irrevocability. So it doesn't matter which word is used, but the idea, that notion of something being a final or irrevocable decision being given about a doctrine has to be manifest somehow, and that's the note of definition. So a couple of, again, I think two sort of questions to dig into that a little more. Two, what I think are common misapplications of this condition for papal infallibility. One is, does the statement have to include a condemnation or threaten excommunication? So in Vatican I's formulation of papal infallibility, right, the very last line is, should anybody, God forbid, reject his teaching, anathema sit. A lot of the definitions and judgments of councils, especially Trent and Vatican I, include that anathema sit at the end of their canons and so forth. So sometimes people have the idea, I think, that that's a necessary condition to recognize a proper definition. But that's not the case. Again, to use a distinction we've used already a few times, when you have that formal condemnation or that formal threat of excommunication, that's a sufficient indication. That's a really clear indicator that this is being given definitively, that this is a definition. That's a sufficient indication, but it's not a necessary indication. It's not necessary in order to fulfill this criterion. So the Pope could make it very, very clear. He could manifest his intention to define a doctrine definitively. That's redundant. Sorry. He could manifest his intention to define by saying something like, "This doctrine must be definitively held by all the faithful." That would be more than adequate, more than sufficient to fulfill this note of definition, even without the threat of excommunication on those who disagree. So when those are present, those condemnations or anathema sits and so forth, those make it really easy to identify the act of definition, but they're not absolutely necessary. Second, last kind of point I want to get into for this whole lecture on the note of definition. Does it have to define something new? In order to be a definition of the extraordinary magisterium, of the Pope speaking ex cathedra, does it have to be defining something new? This is really a bit of an odd one, because why would it be? I mean, you have the thing in Vatican I and Vatican II talking about how infallibility is given to the Pope, not so, and to the bishops, not so that they can invent new doctrines, not so because they receive new revelations, but only to faithfully transmit divine revelation. So that's the teaching in both councils, that the purpose of infallibility of the Pope in particular and of the Church in general is only to faithfully transmit the same teaching received from Christ through the apostles. So where would this idea come from that it's not an infallible definition unless it's defining something new? Well, I mean, I could get into, I think, the historical basis for the idea, but I'm not too interested in that right now. The idea came to prominence in the controversy surrounding Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, Pope John Paul II's declaration concerning the impossibility for the Church to ordain women to the priesthood. Because John Paul II uses very definitive language in that declaration, he says, well, I'm not going to be able to recite it offhand, but he definitely includes that key line, which comes almost verbatim from Bishop Gasser's explanation of what it means to define a doctrine, where he says, proposing a doctrine as one which must be held by the universal church. That's Gasser on the note of definition. And John Paul II in that declaration says, this judgment must be held by the universal church. Now, so you would think that would be a clear case of fulfilling at least this condition for infallibility. But Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, who was prefect of the CDF, and Archbishop Bertone, who was the secretary, I think, of the CDF at the time, in several articles that they wrote in L'Osservatore Romano, and I think in a cover letter maybe that Ratzinger sent to the bishops about a response to a question on this topic from the CDF. They promoted this idea that the Pope, when he confirms or reaffirms something that the Church has already taught infallibly, then his act of confirmation or reaffirmation of this previously existing doctrine. And they give the impression that, like, no matter how formal or definitive or solemn this act is, that it could only ever be an act of his ordinary and non-infallible magisterium. So they don't put it exactly in those terms, but their arguments and their reasoning about Ordinatio Sacerdotalis very much amounts to saying that the extraordinary magisterium of the Church is limited to new definitions of doctrine or new formulations of doctrine, because their argument is that since this doctrine of the reservation of priestly ordination to men alone has already been taught infallibly by the Church, therefore a papal act of teaching on the same subject can't be ex cathedra and must therefore only be the non-infallible ordinary papal magisterium. That reasoning implies the totally unnecessary and totally baseless claim that the extraordinary magisterium is limited to new definitions or formulations of doctrine, to the definition of new doctrines. So, yeah, I want to say it respectfully, but also very emphatically. That's totally baseless. And unfortunately, that idea is even hinted at in the otherwise very good doctrinal commentary on the Profession of Faith that Ratzinger and Bertone wrote in 1998 to go along with the Profession of Faith the CDF promulgated and those concluding 3 paragraphs. In that doctrinal commentary, which, like I said, is otherwise very good, but which has no magisterial authority of its own, because even though it was published from the CDF and not just from Ratzinger and Bertone privately, it didn't receive the papal approbation that is necessary for documents of the Roman congregations to participate in the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. But it says in that commentary, when they're talking about a doctrine that has already been infallibly taught by the Church, they say that such a doctrine can be confirmed or reaffirmed by the Roman Pontiff even without recourse to a solemn definition. Now, maybe that leaves it open that it could also be done with a solemn definition. But given what Ratzinger and Bertone say on the same subject in their private writings, it's unlikely that that's what they meant. But anyway, the text of the commentary goes on. The declaration of confirmation or reaffirmation by the Roman Pontiff in this case, it's very clear that they're talking about Ordinatio Sacerdotalis here. The declaration of confirmation or reaffirmation by the Roman Pontiff in this case is not a new dogmatic definition, but a formal attestation of a truth already possessed and infallibly transmitted by the Church. Cardinal Ratzinger, just to give you a couple of the other quotes, in his L'Osservatore Romano article, June 29th, 1994, commenting on Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, he says, the Pope is not proposing any new dogmatic formula, but is confirming a certainty which has been constantly lived and held firm in the Church. In the technical language, one should say, here we have an act of the ordinary magisterium of the Supreme Pontiff, an act, therefore, which is not a solemn definition ex cathedra. That's a huge non sequitur, with all due respect to Cardinal Ratzinger. because there's no basis for jumping from the premise that says what the Pope is speaking about here has always been believed by the Church, to jump to the conclusion that therefore it's not a solemn definition ex cathedra. It's just a non sequitur. Bertone, in his contribution, says, if we were to hold that the Pope must necessarily make an ex cathedra definition whenever he intends to declare a doctrine as definitive, because it belongs to the deposit of faith, follow that again. If we were to hold that the Pope necessarily speaks ex cathedra whenever he intends to declare a doctrine as definitive, but that's what ex cathedra means, that the Pope is declaring a doctrine as definitive. If you read Vatican I, Bishop Gasser, Vatican II, the Pope speaks ex cathedra when, as Pope, he intends to declare a doctrine as definitive. That's what it is. So Bertone thinks, though, that we don't have to hold that the Pope speaks ex cathedra whenever he intends to declare a doctrine as definitive, because it belongs to the deposit of faith. And he thinks that if we did hold that it would imply an underestimation of the ordinary universal magisterium, and infallibility would be limited to the solemn definitions of a Pope or a council. But it wouldn't imply that. If I say the Pope defined something ex cathedra, that doesn't imply that the same thing hadn't already been infallibly taught by the ordinary universal magisterium of the Church, because there's no rule that says the Church can only teach something infallibly once. And in fact, church history gives us plenty of examples of the same doctrines being infallibly taught multiple times. I'll give some of those examples in just a second. But the basic error behind Ratzinger and Bertone's thinking in this area seems to me to lie in this misapplication of the idea that the function of the extraordinary magisterium is to settle controversies of faith. That's one of the things often said about it. That was one of the things Gasser mentioned as an example of a definition, that when the Pope clearly intends to settle any doubts about a doctrine, that would be a definition. But Ratzinger and Bertone take that in a very narrow sense, and then they limit the extraordinary magisterium, the act of defining doctrine, to that. So it's important to remember that there are two very different kinds of controversies that can arise in the Church in matters of faith. There can be legitimate controversies about points of doctrine on which the Church has no settled teaching. And there are illegitimate controversies in which the established teaching of the Church, which does exist, comes to be disputed or denied or obscured by heresies, errors, and heresies. So the view of Ratzinger and Bertone seems to be that the extraordinary magisterium could only function in the former cases of legitimate controversies, where there's not a previously established church teaching, but for some reason think that it couldn't function in the latter case, where there is already an established teaching, but it has come to be disputed or denied by heretics. But in point of fact, it's much, much more urgent for the Church to exercise clear infallibility in the latter cases. When you have legitimate controversies that theologians dispute about unsettled points, it's usually not a matter of urgent necessity for the salvation of souls for the Church to intervene and give an infallible definition on that point. Usually not. However, when there is a matter of established church teaching, and it comes to be obscured or disputed or denied by heretics, and many souls are being led astray by the heresies, that's when it's especially urgent, for the sake of the salvation of souls, for the Church to give a clear, definitive ruling to reaffirm and confirm what the teaching of the Church has always been. In fact, the paradigmatic case of the definition of the consubstantial divinity of the Word of God with the Father at the Council of Nicaea is a great case in point of exactly that. In the year 324 AD, before the Council of Nicaea, it's not the case that the divinity of Jesus Christ was not a matter of legitimate dispute between theologians that everybody was free to take their own sides on. The church from the beginning believed and professed that Jesus Christ was fully God. The heresy of Arius, which obscured or started to obscure that fact, necessitated a solemn definition at the Council of Nicaea, but nothing about that solemn definition being infallible at Nicaea implies that the ordinary magisterium of the church, which had been teaching the divinity of Christ all along, wasn't infallible or wasn't sufficiently clear or anything like that. So the truth is that the solemn judgments of popes and councils, again, are always sufficient to settle controversies of faith, but it's not necessary that there be an actual controversy of faith, much less a legitimate controversy, in order for a solemn judgment to be given. So if there is an existing controversy and the Pope intends to settle it, that's a clear indication that he's defining. But he can also define a doctrine even when there's not any controversy at all. Like in the case of the Assumption of Mary in 1950, there wasn't controversy on that point amongst Catholics. And it wasn't a particularly, I mean, there were plenty of non-Catholics who didn't believe it, but it's not like it was a particular point of controversy that was causing a lot of unrest or dispute or anything like that either. The Pope still can give an infallible definition even when there's not controversy, or even when the controversy is not legitimate. Bishop Gasser actually touches on this point in his speech at Vatican I. So one of the proposals for a change to the text had to be rejected because, Bishop Gasser says, the Reverend Father who suggested this change to the text appears to restrict papal infallibility only to controversies of faith, whereas the Pope is also infallible as universal teacher and as supreme witness of tradition, the deposit of faith. So in something like Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, if it's correct, as Ratzinger said, and as I believe certainly, that the Pope in this case was not defining a new doctrine. He wasn't introducing a new belief into the life of the church, because the reservation of the priesthood to men alone had always been held and practiced by the church. So he wasn't settling a controversy in that sense, but he was settling a controversy in the broader sense, as he himself says in the introductory part of that declaration. He says, because this point has come to be disputed and questioned by many, therefore, he says, in order to settle all doubt, that's a key notation of an infallible definition as well, he goes on to make his declaration. So there was a controversy, in fact, even though it was not a legitimate one because of the previously established church teaching. But even if that weren't the case, and all he was doing was bearing testimony, confirming or reaffirming what had always been believed and held in the church, handed down through tradition from the deposit of faith itself, even in that capacity, he's still infallible as the universal teacher, as Bishop Gasser says, supreme witness of tradition, the deposit of faith. All right, I mentioned a few historical examples. We'll just close with this. So the whole line of argument of Ratzinger Bertone hinges on a couple of false premises. One is that the same doctrine can't be infallibly taught more than once. That's not true. And the other is that the extraordinary magisterium is limited to new formulations. So I talked about that last one a lot. Let me go back and just close on the first one. The idea that the same doctrine can't be infallibly taught more than once. Right? This is implied in the reasoning which says, like of Bertone, where he says, if we said Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is infallible, we would be calling into doubt the infallibility of the ordinary and universal magisterium, which had transmitted that teaching up to us so far, right? So we want to see that that doesn't call that into doubt. And similarly, Ratzinger's reasoning that since Ordinatio Sacerdotalis didn't say anything new, therefore it could only belong to the ordinary magisterium and not to the extraordinary magisterium, as if the extraordinary magisterium could only say something that hadn't been said before. So several examples here now from history of where the solemn judgments of the church are given on points which have already been infallibly taught and defined, right? Just to see that there's nothing about the previous state of doctrine that places any limitations on the ability of the Pope or the Church to give a solemn definition on a doctrine. So I mentioned the Council of Nicaea is one great example already, that the divinity of Christ was infallibly taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium from 33 AD to 324, and then it was solemnly defined in 325, and that's fine. It's been solemnly defined many times since then, by the way. Every creed promulgated since then, every infallible creed promulgated since then has included the divinity of Christ. Similarly, the Council of Trent defined the necessity of good works for salvation, but it would be ridiculous to think that that was an open question until then. So from the words of St. James in the New Testament, that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone, the church had always believed and infallibly taught through her ordinary and universal magisterium that works are necessary for justification. Not works alone, obviously, faith and works, but that works are necessary in some fashion for justification had always been taught, although it wasn't solemnly defined until Trent. But imagine Cardinal Ratzinger's reasoning applied to the Council of Trent. He would say, he doesn't say this, I don't think, but if you applied his reasoning, which he gives with respect to Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, to the Council of Trent, you would have to say this, that because the church has always believed that man is justified by works and not by faith alone, therefore the Council of Trent is not infallible in its definitions on that point. That's absurd. Another case, the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture. Not only, Leo XIII, in his encyclical on Scripture, he sets out the Church's teaching on inspiration and and the inerrancy of Scripture, and then he says that that this teaching, one and the same teaching, which he's just summarized, is the ancient and unchanging faith of the Church. So that could translate to is what's been infallibly taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. And then he goes on, which has been solemnly defined in the councils of Florence and of Trent. So one and the same teaching, infallibly taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium, infallibly taught by the solemn definition at Florence, infallibly taught by a solemn definition at Trent. So there's nothing standing in the way of multiple repeated infallible teachings of the same doctrine. Last example, I mentioned already the Assumption of Mary in 1950, infallibly defined by Pope Pius XII. In the body of his constitution, before you get to the actual text of the definition at the end, he describes the process that led to the definition. He conducted this consultation of the worldwide church. He asked the bishops to send him letters telling him what they themselves believed and taught and what their people believed and held about the Assumption of Mary. He received from the Universal Church this universal confirmation that the bishops and people of the Catholic Church throughout the world all held as a matter of divine revelation that Mary had been assumed into heaven. And so Pius XII says in there, one of the reasons why he feels confident in proceeding to give an infallible definition of this dogma, he says, is because it is already a truth taught infallibly as a dogma of faith by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Now, again, that's exactly, so if you applied Cardinal Ratzinger or Bertone's reasoning to this, you'd have to say you'd have to say, if that's right, so since the whole church already believed, and the ordinary and universal magisterium already taught in 1949 that Mary was assumed into heaven, since that was already believed and taught infallibly in the church, then Pius XII's definition could only be an act of the non-infallible, merely authentic, ordinary papal magisterium, and it's not ex cathedra, which again is absurd. I mean, Pius XII's definition of the Assumption of Mary is one of the most evident cases of which there's almost zero controversy, that is certainly an ex cathedra definition. So sorry to dwell on that one for such a long time. It's just that because Cardinal Ratzinger is such a well-respected theologian, for good reason, that his erroneous ideas about this point have spread far and wide amongst good Catholic theologians, and it's causing massive confusion about what counts as a ex cathedra teaching and what doesn't. So it's very important to see that there's really no basis for these claims about, well, let me try to put it most succinctly. The idea that the ordinary magisterium always and only has to do with transmitting the same doctrine, and that the extraordinary magisterium always and only has to do with defining new doctrine, is very dangerous and very baseless. We have to put that aside from our thinking about these things. The actual criteria given, you read Vatican I, you read Vatican II, you read Bishop Gasser's explanations, there's nothing anywhere even remotely hinting at the idea that the extraordinary magisterium or the Pope speaking ex cathedra is limited only to new doctrinal formulations or new definitions. So I'll leave it at that. Hour and a half. That's enough.
All right, let me change the view here. All right, there we go. So I have just a couple questions if you have a few moments, Dr. Joy.
Sure.
All right, so the first one is you started by going over the First Vatican Council, and of course it speaks about when the Pope speaks ex cathedra. My question relates to the usage of the term ex cathedra in the church today. Ex cathedra, of course, means from the chair of St. Peter. Well, can we say that even non-definitive papal teachings are from the chair of St. Peter, loosely speaking, insofar as he's speaking as a pope, as the successor of St. Peter, with the authority of Peter, though maybe not definitively? Because when we look at the non-definitive teachings, even those, it seems that the popes appeal to the Petrine texts in scripture as the basis for even their non-definitive teachings. So could we not say that maybe in a broad sense, even non-definitive papal teachings are ex cathedra?
Okay, do you remember the discussion of the minor theological censures?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think that proposition would have to be censured as male sonans, evil sounding. Meaning, even though it could be technically true, so the way you described it you could use that term in that way, and you would be describing something true.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the way the term has been used in Vatican I,
Right,
speaking in that way would sound wrong to most Catholics and would lead to some errors. So the other great example I think I mentioned when we were talking about that was Thomas Aquinas at one point. I don't remember if I mentioned this. Thomas Aquinas at one point says man is justified by faith alone.
yeah.
And that's perfectly true when you mean it the way Thomas Aquinas meant it.
Mm-hmm.
But after the Reformation controversies, a Catholic can't really say that anymore with propriety. He can't really say that because it'll be too difficult for people to understand that in the right way. And I think a similar thing would happen here. If you used ex cathedra in a broader sense, after it's been defined in this narrow sense at Vatican I think you would just do more harm than good.
It would just confuse everybody.
Yeah. But it is true that he is still speaking in an official, so when he speaks in a non-definitive way, but as head of the whole church, as the Pope. So in the encyclicals, for example, that he sends to the whole church, yeah, so those are still coming in some sense from his role as Pope, and that's the chair of Peter. But I just would. So
You would avoid it.
as a fun idea to play with, maybe yes, but as something to
Yeah.
like actually use in speech and writing,
Right.
There's a really interesting thing there too, by the way. So in all of if you read theologians on these questions before Vatican I,
mm-hmm.
so like from Bellarmine all the way to Vatican I, you'll always read them distinguishing between the ex cathedra teaching and the private teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And by ex cathedra, they are talking about like the fully definitive teaching, the really binding and infallible teaching, and the private teaching. And you scratch your head at some point and be like, well, didn't they know about like this whole middle category of public and official but non-definitive teaching?
Right.
And there are a couple of ways. There are a couple of ways you might look at that. And one is to say, like, the popes just didn't exercise that teaching very often, and so theologians didn't think of it, and it was just kind of like it was a real category, but such an unimportant one that nobody ever talked about it. The other possibility, though, which I saw an author explore in a book called "Can the Pope Be a Heretic?" I forget the author's name, but I'll dig that up for one of these coming lectures.
Yeah.
He actually explores a little bit the possibility that when somebody like Bellarmine says the Pope's speaking as a private doctor, he actually does mean that kind of official but not definitive teaching. So that's kind of weird to our way of thinking, but it's an interesting possibility that they may have been aware of that whole category of non-infallible but really papal teaching, and been describing that as the private teaching in a way that's similar to how you might call the teaching of your local bishop his private teaching. Maybe it doesn't sound right to modern ears.
Right, because we think of Benedict writing his book Jesus of Nazareth. When
exactly.
That makes sense, because I'm not buying the idea that this would have just been something that completely escaped them, or that they were aware of it, but none of them talked about it because it just didn't come up a lot. To me, it seems that there are many teachings of the popes from the first millennium and second millennium that would fall in that category. So there are interesting things like with the Monothelite controversy. Which pope was that? Was that Honorius? You have Pope Honorius, of course, with the Monothelite issue, writing to Sergius.
Right, because he writes the letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople,
Sergius,
is it?
Right. Patriarch Sergius,
in which he teaches the false doctrine. You see a lot of the historical Catholic theologians kind of explaining how that doesn't undermine the dogma of infallibility by saying that was an act that was like a private teaching, and that's never made sense to me. Because, come on, a letter between the Pope and the Patriarch on a doctrinal point. There's nothing private about that. That's for real public.
Yeah.
But then you wonder, but when they said that was a act of the Pope as a private doctor, did they just mean by that it was this middle category, that it was like official and papal, but since it wasn't definitive, that they referred to it as a private doctor? So in other words, here's a way of thinking of that private and public distinction that I'm at least intrigued by. So I don't know quite what to make of this, but what if you took private and public? So only when the Pope speaks infallibly, I do believe this is true. Only when the Pope speaks infallibly can you make the direct equation and say, like, the Church speaks. Right? When the Pope teaches something infallibly, I can say the Church teaches that thing. And when the bishops teach infallibly, I can say the Church teaches that thing.
Sure.
But when the Pope speaks non-infallibly, I can't make the jump to say the Church teaches that.
Makes sense, yeah.
Right? So maybe the Pope, like as a public person, is more like the Pope in persona ecclesiae, and the Pope as a private person is the Pope in persona pepe, like he's acting in his own role and office, but not in the person of the church herself. I don't know. That's an interesting.
That is, I haven't heard that before. That's really interesting.
Well, I made it up on the spot, so.
Well, I think that there's something to be said there, and also in the case of Honorius, I think that I actually would use that to appeal to the distinction between a non-definitive and definitive papal teaching. But I would say, but then we still have to ask the question, did he err whenever he taught it non-definitively? Because I think it's interesting whenever you read Pope John IV, one of his successors, he writes an apology for him and says he was Orthodox. He did not mean anything. He did not mean the monothelite. What he meant by one will was that the divine and human will were in agreement. They're not contradictory to each other. So I think that there's maybe something to be said there. But then how does that?
I know that's a really fascinating case. It'd be fun to explore that sometime more thoroughly.
I think
because
so.
if you go that route though, then you've got to deal with the ecumenical council.
Exactly.
Condemning him as a heretic. So like
exactly. So you have to deal with the Sixth Council there. Did it
err in poison?
Did it err in a matter of fact? Right? Because we couldn't say that an ecumenical council would err in a matter of faith and morals, but could it err in matters of fact? And is this a matter of fact, whether or not Honorius was a heretic? So,
well, sure.
Yeah.
But then you've got the question of the secondary object, and like, okay,
sure.
But you know,
and did they define it as a secondary object? Right. So there's a whole lot of work that has to really be done there.
That is a fun one. Yep.
It is a fun one worth exploring. So my next question is, how many ex cathedra teachings would you say that there are? You knew it was coming.
Yeah, I've never counted them.
Yeah.
I think there are more than two.
Yeah.
I'll give you that. So actually, our topic next time is going to be looking at a series of particular cases. So we're going to go through maybe like a dozen, if we have time, different papal documents that have been that there's been argument about, is this infallible or not? So I'll give you the short answer. I definitely think there's more than two. I think that's really just historical ignorance speaking most of the time when Catholics say that there are only two.
Right.
Bishop Gasser at the First Vatican Council, in that long speech he gives, he makes an offhand comment at one point that there have already been thousands and thousands of infallible judgments from the Apostolic See. Now, I've never seen that many. I think we can allow for some hyperbole there. You know, this is just like a rhetorical exaggeration. But at the same time, that if there had literally only been like 6, it would be pretty absurd to say thousands and thousands. And part of that has to do with how you count them too, because if you take something like Unigenitus, which is the condemnation of the errors of Quesnel, there are 101 separate propositions condemned there. So you could count that as 1, or you could count that as 101.
Right, the global censors. Yeah.
So we talked about that last time. So if you count that at all, you could count that as 1 or as 101. And there are a bunch of them like that. So if you count them all, like if you count each distinct proposition as a distinct infallible definition, then you could get at least hundreds and hundreds. I don't know about thousands and thousands. Again, just quickly here, there were a couple of, not many people have tried to draw up lists. And I don't know anybody who's tried to draw up an exhaustive list. But Louis Bilot and Edmond Dublanchet in the early 1900s. Dublanchet's was in the massive French Dictionary of Catholic Theology, this huge reference work. So in his article in there on papal infallibility, he has like 12 examples. And below in his manual on ecclesiology, he has about 12 examples. That's counting documents. If you opened those up and counted all the individual propositions, you'd probably get, well, at least into the hundreds. So I'd put it somewhere in there. I'm going to say if you're counting documents, there have been more than 12. I'm not going to give you a number.
Yeah, sure. But somewhere around there as far as just documents.
Do you know Saliveri's? The BAC published this
The Summa Sacra
Sacra
Theologia.
Summa
Yeah.
Theologia. In his consideration, he quotes another author who did a deep study of the first millennium,
Right.
and finds he counts something like 20 ex cathedra statements just in the first millennium. That list of 12 from Du Blanchet and below is second millennium mostly. So if you put those together, now I haven't investigated every one of those instances to say like I would agree with the evaluation. But that would put you into the 30s maybe in terms of documents.
Right.
But so I'd take that as my ballpark. It's probably been something like that.
Why do you think that some would say it's only 2? Like Ronner, I think Ronner takes that position. Why only 2? I mean,
my suspicion, I mean, so I can only cast aspersions here. My suspicion is that it's often ecumenically motivated. There's often a desire. So the Catholic authors that you see like push that idea the most are the Protestant converts who are, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about, I love the Protestant convert apologists. Like Scott Hahn was super influential, like when I was in high school, listening to tapes and stuff, like learning that there's more to the Catholic faith than I ever imagined. And I've never heard him push this idea. But I think there's often a desire on the part of Catholics who are especially interested in kind of pushing the apologetics to the Protestants, and this is well motivated, to want to make there be as few obstacles to their conversion as possible.
Sure.
And papal infallibility is a big stumbling block, but if you can say it's only ever been used twice, that can make it seem like it's much less of a stumbling block. You're not really doing anybody a service by pushing that idea. But I don't know. That's at least part of the motivation, I think, sometimes.
I could definitely see that. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, those are the all the questions that I had. This was excellent. I really look forward to the next one. You said that you're going to be looking at the documents specifically going into papal.
Yeah, we'll go blow by blow through a handful of the documents. So we touched on Ordinatio Sacerdotalis a little bit here today. So I might say just a little bit about that one. But Evangelium Vitae of John Paul II is an interesting one. Even Veritatis Splendor is an interesting one. Humanae Vitae, of course, there's been controversy about. And then some of the older historical cases as well, like Unigenitus that we talked about last time, or Quanta Cura, or Condemnation of Martin Luther. What was that one called? Exsurge Domine.
Exsurge Domine, yeah. That's a fun one.
So there's been a lot of interesting ones to dig into.
Yeah, especially the one dealing with the death penalty on that one. That should be interesting.
We might not want to mention that one. People will be horrified. Let them look it up themselves.
Yeah, right, for sure. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. These are excellent lectures. There's nothing out there like this. So thank you for taking your time and providing it for us.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's always fun. Thanks, Michael.
Looking forward to the next one. Everybody, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll get access to extra content and also support what we're doing here. All right. Till next time. God bless.